Someone in Harlem tried to humiliate Bumpy Johnson's widow in front of the whole neighborhood. What he didn't know was that the wrong man was already on his way to the church with a plan that would freeze every chest in the pews. On July 7, 1968, the Abbiscinian Baptist Church smelled like lilies and damp suits, like grief pressed into Sunday best. Word of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's death had traveled down Lenox Avenue and into storefronts and barber shops before the sun fully rose. People came because he had been a presence. Feared, respected, impossible to ignore. They came because Harlem needed to see how it handled the death of its own. And they came because they wanted to know what came next. Frank Lucas woke that morning like a man who had stepped into cold water. He had been Bumpy's driver, a loyal shadow for years. He had learned the pattern of power by watching, running errands, and carrying messages. A driver can be invisible for a reason. He learns how to stand behind people who make decisions, how to read the room without being read back. Still, underneath loyalty there had been a quiet ambition. A store of small savings accumulated the hard way. Working 2 jobs, staying out of sight, doing favors for men who claimed more than they paid. When the call came that Bumpy was gone, Frank felt a strange arithmetic settle in his chest. Someone had to answer for the man who had kept Harlem in a rough balance. If not a system, then at least a face. Before the funeral, he went to his bank. He withdrew everything he had stashed away. The money he had meant for something private, the money he had meant to keep as a cushion. There are gestures that require no speech, only weight. He placed the currency into a briefcase and sat with the metallic click of the latch for a long time, like a man listening to the sound of the last step before a plunge. He dressed simply. He had no intention of being theatrical. But he had intention, and intention carries its own kind of danger. The Abyssinian filled, city officials and preachers, shopkeepers and school teachers, men in expensive suits who tried to look mournful, and men with knuckles the color of work who did not try at all. Cameras were not a constant then like now, but faces watched, and Harlem watched those faces. In a front pew sat Bumpy's widow. Quiet, composed. The center of a congregation that understood public grief as a kind of ceremony with rules. Around her, the current of conversation vibrated low. Who would step into the vacuum? Who would try to tilt the scales now that the king had been taken? At a funeral, respect is performed. It is a set of small rituals that say as much as any contract: where you stand, where your coat is folded, how close you sit to the casket. Those arrangements were not arbitrary at Abyssinian that day. They were a map of what men thought they could claim. And the map was wrong. Near the hymnals, a man not named in any official report, an unwelcome observer of other men's reputations, leaned forward and allowed himself a look at Bumpy's widow that did not belong to mourning. He said something meant to be heard, a cheap attempt to diminish the gravity of the room. What follows is a dramatized reconstruction. In the hush after the prayer, the man let a barbed jest drop toward the widow, as if daring the neighborhood to stand aside. Heads turned. The words were soft but sharp. The air tightened. If that moment happened exactly as some remembered retelling later, it was because humiliation often prefers a public place. Frank had been in the back, quiet, watching faces and watching the way the light fell across the casket. The briefcase lay like a small, private thunder by his knee. He walked forward as the minister finished, not as a man rushing, but as a man who had rehearsed a single movement enough to remove hesitation. He set the briefcase on the casket and opened it. Inside were 10 stacks of bills. $100,000. The sound of paper is rarely loud, but the church inhaled like a lung refusing a drink. Men who had been speaking in measured tones suddenly found themselves breathless. The bundles looked impossibly plain and perfectly explosive at once. Money meant to buy silence, to buy loyalty, or to buy the attention that replaces both. Frank did not make a long speech. He stepped forward and spoke in a voice that did not need to ask for permission to be heard. He said, "In this life, you're either somebody or you're nobody." The sentence landed like a judge's gavel. It was not flourish. It was a definition, laid down where everyone could see it, right on top of the casket. That phrase, simple, blunt, was the public contract. Where law and lineage had tangled in the old way of doing things, Frank offered another economy. Cash, placed visibly, in full view of rivals and watchers and the widow. The money itself was less the point than the message. He was not buying the casket. He was buying the story that would be told after the funeral. He was buying a throne made of currency and ceremony. The man who had tried to humiliate Bumpy's widow sank back into his chair, as if someone had emptied the air from his lungs. The humiliation he had tried to inflict found itself returned to him, now magnified, pennies compared to a roll of bills on a corpse. No one grabbed the money, no one shouted. The city's underworld had always relied on a balance of public signals. Frank had shifted the balance in the space of a heartbeat. There was a moral calculus in that decision, obvious and ugly. A man in a suit later would look at the shuffling of young faces outside the church and say with a kind of professional distance that the move was brilliant. Another would note it was brutal. Both assessments were true. $100,000 was also a spark in a dry place. It was money taken from somewhere and spent where it would make people look at each other in a new way. For every man whose eyes widened with respect, there was a child somewhere who would be touched by the consequences of what that money would procure later. It would be dishonest, intellectually and morally, to praise the audacity without saying what audacity bought. Addiction, broken families, quiet neighborhoods turned into markets for poison. The crowd in Abbiscinian could feel that tension at the edges of the ceremony, even if they could not yet name the cost. After Frank's sentence, the room held a strange, reverent quiet. Men recalculated. Women prayed a little longer for a different kind of peace. The minister's voice felt thin against the weight of what the money seemed to declare. The public humiliation had been averted, if humble honor could be restored by a roll of bills. But the spectacle had shifted the question. It was no longer simply about the respect due at a funeral. It was about who would have the courage to step into a vacancy of power. When the procession spilled onto the street, the sun felt colder than it had an hour before. Men crossed themselves, not in worship, but in a calculation. There is now someone who has shown he will spend what it takes to be obeyed. That image, the briefcase laid like an offering on top of the casket, would be the anchor of a new myth. For 5 years, in the stories that would be told and retold, that photograph would appear, sometimes blurred, sometimes sharp, always serving as proof that power could be acquired by display. But displays have a lifespan, and visibility can breed enemies as surely as it can purchase friends. Outside the church, Frank did not stay to be congratulated or cursed. He walked with the briefcase now empty in the sense that the money had been spent at the casket, but heavy in another way. The weight of responsibility. The weight of a choice whose consequences he could feel like a new ache in his chest. He had not wanted to speak to cameras, had not wanted the limelight. Yet he had chosen a public theater precisely because the new rule he offered needed witnesses. A few men tried to approach him with the polite posture of those asking for favor or declaring rivalry. Faces he had known as part of the neighborhood observed him as an equal for the first time. Others watched from the corners of Main Street and Lenox. Wherever men gathered, wherever someone might later tally the costs and profits of an arrangement, people saw the sign Frank had placed. Someone slipped into a payphone 2 blocks away. Names moved up and down lines in the same way money had moved earlier in the day. One of those connections found its way to Carmine Trant. The Italian figure who watched Harlem affairs with interest had not expected a man like Frank to make such a declaration. The briefcase on the casket was a message not just to Harlem, but to every organized interest that measured the city like a ledger. It read, "I will not ask permission to act." Frank had understood the gravity of that message. He also understood, in a careful, pragmatic way, that symbolism alone could not secure the kind of lasting order he wanted. Symbol buys attention. Structure buys control. He left the church with the knowledge that a reckoning would come, because power does not announce itself and vanish politely. It must be defended, negotiated, and sometimes bled for. The afternoon that followed was quieter than the morning. News outlets ran the image of a man in a modest coat standing in front of a casket with a briefcase at his feet. In the neighborhood, business continued with the peculiar stiffness of a community reassessing its rules. Frank walked back to a rented room where his wife, Eva, waited. Patient, frightened, and necessary as an anchor. She had been his witness for years. To his nights of long work, to his choices that sometimes bent toward risk. She did not wear extravagance. Her steadiness was the kind of respect that counted more than any headline, and she watched him with the hard, honest assessment of someone who had seen the cost of his ambitions up close. He told her he had placed the money on the casket, and she listened without praise. She knew the arithmetic of the neighborhood better than most, that any victory can be paid for in ways that take decades to catalog. Her silence spoke of fear and of an intimacy that had nothing to do with business. She understood, in a way the men with cameras did not, that public gestures had private consequences. In the immediate days after the funeral, messages came in the form of small threats. A curt call from a man with a taste for leverage, a veiled warning from someone with Italian vowels, and a calm voice, the kind that hints at networks reaching back through the docks and the high-priced rooms of Atlantic City. The word 6 months would later be attached to a deal, an offer that sounded like mercy, but was really a test. But that exchange had not yet been written. For now, the neighborhood watched to see if the briefcase had been a single good act, or the first line of a new order. There are times when the bravest act is silence, and others when a catalytic display must be made. Frank had chosen the latter, and men on both sides of the law took stock. Police noted the photograph and the names. Priests filed condolences and pressed palms. Competitors tallied the cost of a rival who did not mind being conspicuous when it mattered. Even as plans and meetings circulated, another calculation gnawed at the edges: how to transform spectacle into supply. To sit on a throne is one thing. To keep the throne requires logistics. That arithmetic of who will bring product into the city, who will secure distribution, who will keep their mouths shut, would be written in the months to come. For the moment, however, Abbiscinian's pews still echoed with hymn and disbelief, and the widow of Bumpy Johnson sat and let the community's attention fall where it needed to. The attempt to humiliate her had been framed back toward dignity. The gesture had worked, and with its success came the slow, dark realization that dignity bought that day would demand its price in the market that sprang up afterward. Tell me, would you have had the courage to do what Frank did? Comment below. The phone calls began that evening. A man Frank had seen only in the periphery of deals and dinners, an emissary for Carmine Tranta, asked to meet. The voice on the other end was not crude. It was measured, as if all the violence he could command had been put on a ledger and now balanced with careful words. "We don't like surprises," the voice said. "We respect a fallen king. We notice an empty throne with money on it." There was no laughter in that sentence, only the thin sound of an offer turning into a threat. Frank listened. He did not speak much. He had learned that silence could be more expensive than speech and sometimes more valuable. He was not a match for the Italians in raw muscle or in deep old family networks. He had, however, something they had not fully counted on: the moral claim of Harlem itself, and the fact that he could move faster than men who were used to moving through permission. That night, he sat with the quiet of a man who knew he had opened a door he could not easily close. He had made things worse for some and easier for others. He had bought himself a stage and, with it, the attention of powerful people who budgeted loyalty like inventory. Somewhere beyond the lamplight, a plan was already sketching itself: how to take the moment and turn it into an advantage that would not just be about respect, but about control. As the sun set over Harlem, men who had spent the morning crossing themselves and frowning at pictures of a casket made calculations in rooms with paperback chairs. A rival tossed and turned. A priest prayed harder. Eva slept without rest. Frank closed his eyes and tried to imagine what running a neighborhood would require, beyond the courage of a single, unforgettable gesture. He knew that spectacle was only a beginning, that the real work would be invisible, bureaucratic, and brutal in its efficiency. Outside, in the back rooms and the long-shouldered offices of men who kept accounts in pencil and fear, someone sat down to write a reply. The first line of that reply would be done over dinner in a place called Ralph's, where deals often wore the face of casual business, and where the real negotiation of Harlem's future would begin. That conversation would mark the crossing from symbolism to structure. An exchange where men would test whether the money on the casket had been an empty boast or the opening of a new order. Frank did not know then how long the seat he had claimed would hold. He knew only that in a world where respect was currency, he had paid up in full, and that payments always required more. The silence he left at Abbiscinian had been loud enough to wake a city. He had bought attention. He had also invited challenge. When the next call came through, one that would set in motion a meeting that would test his nerve and his willingness to bargain with forces older and broader than any he had known. Frank was ready in the sense that a man can be ready for anything except certainty. He understood that a man who saw himself as somebody must sometimes speak in a coin that every observer could understand. He had done that at the casket. Now he would find out how many would listen, and how many would take the briefcase as the beginning of a story they intended to write themselves. They met at Ralph's like men who do business under a ceiling that has learned to keep secrets. The restaurant smelled of coffee and old cigarettes. The conversation moved as if measured by the clink of silverware. Carmine Tronti arrived with a calm so practiced it felt like an instrument. He had watched cities the way bankers watch accounts, patient, with margins calculated into muscle. Frank sat across from him with the quiet of a man who had already paid for his announcement. He did not posture. He let the photograph of the briefcase do some of the talking. The Italians did not need to be told that someone in Harlem had made a public claim. They only needed to know whether that claim would cost them more than ignoring it. The meeting at Ralph's was a negotiation disguised as civility. "We don't want trouble," Tronte said, letting the words land like a rope thrown into the water. "We want order." In the room, order meant pieces of the city that could be divided and counted. Frank replied with restraint. He spoke in the economy he trusted. Short sentences, small truths. He did not boast about the briefcase. He explained the logic behind it. Harlem, he said, belonged to Harlem. Respect had to be managed by people who lived there. They reached a bargain of sorts, not a surrender on either side, but a conditional test. "Give me 6 months," Frank said without naming the term, "and I will show you a way to keep things steady." Tronte accepted a clock rather than a crown. 6 months to prove the new arrangement would not spill over into the other neighborhoods they controlled. It was a merciful-sounding concession, but it was, in truth, a challenge. If Frank could keep profits steady and violence low, the Italians would give him breathing room. If he failed, they promised to act. Leaving Ralph's, Frank understood what the deal meant. The briefcase had bought him a chance, brief and dangerous. What followed would be less drama than systems work. The paperwork of power, the slow building of roots, the recruitment of people who could both charm and obey. He picked his players with the same cold efficiency he used at the funeral. Visibility needed a face. Control needed a shadow. He chose Nicky Barnes as the public figurehead, someone flashy who could take applause without having his fingers traced back to the origin point. Nicky had swagger, a knack for celebrity, and an appetite for being seen. He gave Nicky a storefront, a persona, a way to distract eyes that might otherwise search too deeply for the man who had laid cash on a casket. Frank himself moved inward. He set up a lattice of loyalties and ledgers, an operation that valued silence over spectacle. He learned to read the commerce of supply the way he had learned to read streets, where ships moved, how men spoke at docks, which accounts were padded with bribes. The real brilliance, if brilliance can be disentangled from moral ruin, was not only in a public act, but in a logistical revolution. Instead of buying from middlemen who took cuts and left traces, Frank sought to cut the middle out entirely. The Golden Triangle, those river valleys and opium fields in Southeast Asia, was where the raw material was coming from. Frank found a chain that bypassed the layers that inflated cost and risk. He made arrangements that linked suppliers to couriers in a way that dropped purity up and price down. The network involved intermediaries who could be trusted not to talk. Corsican contacts on one end, American soldiers and corrupt officials on the other. He used relationships he had formed over years, men who moved freight, men who kept quiet for the sake of a wage. In the darkest irony, the very institutions that mourned soldiers and preserved honor were bent into channels that passed something deadly back into American neighborhoods. The method of getting the product stateside became legend for a reason. Men spoke about coffins the way sailors spoke about rocks at sea, an answer that made sense because it played on taboos. The truth was bluntly practical. Bodies being transported from war zones were treated with a kind of sacrosanct caution that most officials did not violate. Frank's people found, through bribery and cold accounting, a way to have crates and coffins move without the same scrutiny as commercial cargo. Men who handled the logistics ensured that the crates labeled with names and honors passed through ports and customs with the paperwork that most would not touch. It was a logistical cruelty with human faces. Supply sergeants, corrupt handlers, Men who rationalized a bribe as compensation for work none of them wanted to think about. Once the product arrived, Frank's operation warred on price and quality. He sold purity at a price that undercut existing suppliers, and the market moved accordingly. Distribution turned into a well-tuned network of storefronts, street-level runners, and the silent accountants who kept the books tight. Money moved in ways that looked like ordinary commerce, payoffs disguised as payments, bank accounts built for legitimate businesses, property purchased under names meant to obscure. The empire grew not with fireworks but with ledgers and loyalty. There were rules. No public quarrels, no senseless killings. Pay the families who needed paying. Keep the police distracted with small favors so bigger problems stayed out of sight. The public face, Nicky, threw parties and flashed wealth, while Frank kept meetings in rooms without windows. In the beginning, the operation achieved something Lee would later call improbable: control with restraint. For a while, violence dipped and profits climbed. Harlem's streets felt like a city under a new management that, for all its cruelty, minimized visible chaos. But that calm was fragile. The more money flowed, the more mistakes mattered. Pride is a particular kind of error. For 5 years that began with the Abbiscinian briefcase, Frank managed a system that many of his rivals thought impossible. Stories circulated of the scale. Cash moving in numbers that sound obscene in daylight. Millions passing through hands in a single week by some counts. The business fed mansions and storefronts, changed wardrobes, and produced the sort of celebrity that attracts attention like moths. Frank tried to stay hidden while those close to him lived large by his light. Then, at a boxing match that should have been nothing more than an exercise in spectacle, he slipped. It was the kind of lapse that reads like a fable. In a room full of men who were careful not to breathe extravagance, Frank allowed his confederates to show it. A chinchilla coat, impossibly soft, impossibly expensive, appeared on a concerted shoulder in the crowd. The coat did more than keep someone warm. It suggested a life beyond the reach of ordinary means. That single image threaded into the public record like a bright wire leading back to a power source. Detectives are patient animals. They collect images, they note anomalies, and they wait for people to do what people always do: be human. Richie Roberts watched the display as a detective might watch a man leave footprints across a wet floor. The coat drew a line from opulence to a man whose name had been whispered about in precincts and backrooms. Roberts began to assemble threads: accounts, informants, bank deposits that did not match declared income. He talked to port officials, tracked shipments, and listened to tips that sounded like rumors, until he found the paper trail that turned rumor into evidence. The investigation took years because networks are meant to be opaque. Frank had tried to insulate himself. Laundries of legitimate business, people placed between him and the money. A public persona for Nicky that fractured attention across many hands. But the law had a patience of its own. Surveillance gradually tightened. Phone numbers were traced to accounts, meetings to rooms, and rooms to safes. A single piece of conspicuous pride, the coat, was the fissure through which a verdict-sized machine pushed. By 1975, federal prosecutors had built enough to move. The raid was surgical, executed on a morning when doors opened and men who had spent years expecting to sleep through trouble, instead found new light in the rooms that had sheltered them for so long. Frank was arrested in the net of that operation. The headlines were immediate. The photographs were taken. The machinery of prosecution had a face. Once in custody, Frank faced choices that had always been part of the bargain he struck with himself. He could plead absolute loyalty to an order that had no mercy for informers. Or he could trade names to preserve years of his life. He chose the latter. Cooperation is a complicated currency. To give names is to betray the people who trusted you. To refuse often means a long, blunt sentence. Frank chose to speak. He gave up men who had worn uniforms and men who ate regularly at the same tables Tranta preferred. He named corrupt officers and some of the middlemen who had made his logistics possible. The legal fallout unraveled old networks. Officers were indicted. Mob figures felt pressure that reached back into Atlantic City and beyond. Frank's cooperation did not absolve him. It shortened the calendar of his punishment. He received a reduced sentence because of his testimony, the justice system bargaining for the greater prize of dismantling corruption, rather than seeing one kingpin serve an extreme term without pulling the thread into the rest of the tapestry. When Frank left prison, his return to Harlem was quiet compared to the spectacle that had once accompanied him. He was older. He was a man whose public aura had been carved by microscope and judicial process. The narrative of the briefcase remained, but the publicity that followed his arrest reframed the story. He was a man who had outmaneuvered mafiosi. Yes, but he was also, transparently, one whose business had harmed the neighborhoods he claimed to protect. The coffins, the shipments, the numbers, it all added up to a ledger where the profit column had a shadow in the lives of people who never appeared in his accounts. Addicts, families broken by loss, children whose streets were different because of the market he helped grow. After his release, Frank sought some measure of restitution in the only ways he could manage. Small acts, gestures that could not erase the deep harms. He gave money to some community causes, showed up at events that reminded people he had been part of their life, and kept a lower profile. Some remembered him with the awe born of legend, others saw only the cost, counted in late-night calls and funerals that should never have been necessary. In public memory, he became the man of paradox. Brilliant at strategy, ruthless in execution, and deeply implicated in an industry that spread poison. People told the story of the briefcase and turned it into a kind of proof that theater could buy a throne. They told other stories, too, of addicts who once lived next door, of steady jobs lost to the new economy of quick cash, of nights when the sirens became louder and laughter thinner. Both sets of stories are true. One cannot admire the audacity of a logistical revolution and not, at the same time, reckon with the human damage it financed. There are lessons embedded in the arc of what followed the casket. Power performed through spectacle is vulnerable to the attention it commands. Systems built on secrecy and death carry within them the seeds of exposure. Money moves faster than conscience, and communities pay for the speed. Frank's choice at Abbiscinian was a masterstroke of theater. His later choices, the supply lines, the smuggling, the economy he built, were the reasons the laughs and the applause turned into indictments and investigations. There is no mythic moral that resolves cleanly here. The briefcase gave him a throne for a time, but a throne that was sustained by a market that broke people. When historians and storytellers look back, they see the photograph of a man next to a casket, a briefcase splayed open like a silent orchestra. The image is easy to reproduce in memory and hard to justify in ethics. It bought a 5-year orbit of power. It bought territory and attention and an arrangement that let Frank sit where kings sat, at least until the coat betrayed him. Yet that same money, stacked and ceremonial, was also a mirror of a cost that could not be insured against. The legal and communal unraveling did not come as a sudden moral epiphany for the city. It came in slow, practical ways. Indictments, trials, the seizing of assets, the quiet work of social agencies trying to mend what had been torn. Frank's cooperation toppled some corrupt officials and cleaned up certain corners, but it did not rebuild the lives that had been lost. A dollar cannot call back a childhood, no matter how ceremonious the manner in which it was spent. That is the hard arithmetic at the heart of the story. In some versions of this tale, the man who put cash on a casket is remembered as clever and dominant. In others, he is remembered for the harm he helped institutionalize. Both versions are necessary. Power is performance, yes, but it is a performance with consequences that outlast applause. The briefcase at Abyssinian became the origin myth of an empire. It was also, for many, the emblem of a betrayal of community. As the years thinned into decades, the photograph remained a touchstone. People asked the same question that day. Was it courage or calculation? The honest answer is both. Frank's act was a statement of protection for an insulted widow, and a calculated claim for authority. It was, at once, indignation and investment. The very publicness that defended a woman's dignity also opened a ledger that would be paid in misery. If there is a final, brutal irony to the story, it is this. The same public deed that shielded a family in a moment also set in motion a business that would help unmake families. The distinction between being somebody and being a cause of someone else's ruin is thinner than men like to admit. Frank learned that rule in time, as surely as investigators and grieving neighbors learned it through the slow accumulation of evidence and obituary notices. On the street where the casket had once lain, men still talk about that morning. The story gets told in different accents and with different endings, depending on who is speaking. Some emphasize the courage and the cleverness. Others keep the tally of those who were harmed in the ledger of their words. The photograph never answers for itself. It simply holds a moment. A man, a briefcase, and a city holding its breath. So, the titles claim that a gangster had tried to humiliate Bumpy's wife and that Frank's quiet message froze the whole crew, finds its truth in these layers. There was an attempted slight at a funeral, a dramatized reconstruction of a gauntlet thrown toward a widow. There was a response that was at once symbolic and strategic. And there was consequence after consequence, some immediate, some delayed, many tragic. The briefcase was both shield and spark. What began as a defense of dignity became a blueprint for business, and business, in that instance, carried a human toll that must be named. If you want more of these untold gangster histories, the ones that look glorious in photographs and ugly in people's lives, subscribe and come back. There are more stories like this one waiting, all of them messy, all of them true in their contradictions.